Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Ellie.
Hello, I'm the second half of the duet. I guess if we're Simon and Garfunkel, you can think of me as Garfunkel. So, I was at work on a Wednesday afternoon. I was bored and frustrated. The Tories had just got into government, and I'd always seen them as a kind of unreconstructed, goat-sacrificing evil, and I was horrified that they were ruling our country. But I felt pretty useless, really. And then something started happening on Twitter. Some activists had shut down a Vodafone shop, and it spread like wildfire. It was trending globally, and already I thought, this is huge. At that time, I was hugely disillusioned with politics. I was a lifelong Labour supporter, I still am. And everything that had happened, Blair, Iraq, everything, it just completely sapped my faith. When Thatcher said that her biggest achievement was Tony Blair, I knew then that I'd fallen out of love with politics and it had become something that you rant about, but not something that you act upon. But this was different. It was exciting, it was new, and I knew that I had to get involved. So I emailed the UK Uncut account and asked if there was anything happening in Liverpool, which is where I worked at the time. And I got a bit of a cheeky reply. No, but you could always organise something. I was writing for Liberal Conspiracy at the time. I'm sure many of my Liberal conspirators are here in the audience, so hello if you are. Mainly about the cuts, so I felt it was hypocritical of me not to take up that challenge. And I have to be honest with you, the first protest was awful. There was about 7 activists and about 20 people from Socialist Worker who'd come along to sell magazines anyway and just moved their stall a little bit further down the road, so... But that protest, awful though it might have been, shut down 2 Vodafone shops in Liverpool. And I will continue to be amazed by how easy direct action is, and how quickly companies do roll over when you challenge them. That's what UK Uncut has taught me. Not how hard it is to make a difference, but how easy. And I think it's a lesson I'll never forget. And now I can't believe how much my life has changed. When I think of that first protest, and I was shaking with nerves on the bus on the way there, I can't believe that now I'm running into banks, taking 50 activists and the head of the Tax Justice Network with me, dressed as a schoolmistress. That's me, by the way, not him. I was a rank-and-file lefty before, really. I wasn't a huge radical. But I don't feel like I've been left with much choice but to do this. I don't see any serious arguments from Labour. I'm a working person, and the party that is supposed to defend me spent this weekend telling people not to strike. I just know that I can't let these cuts happen, so I'll have to stop them myself if Labour won't do it. So, I've been pepper sprayed, I've been strip searched, I've been detained, I've been hounded by the Daily Mail. Literally, they phone up my friends and ask about me. There have been tough times. But when I think of what will happen to people as a result of these cuts, that all seems like small beer. I'm a member of the Labour Party, and I'm a member of Unite, and I'm someone who gets involved in direct action. I hope I act as evidence that it's possible to do both. I want the Labour Party to take a leaf out of UK Uncut's book. I mean, I can't imagine Ed Miliband running into Boots dressed in scrubs, but he should be a little bit braver, a little bit riskier. In a few years' time, the cuts will have devastated the lives of thousands, if we let that happen. Then, people will be looking back on the Labour Party, and they will ask, which side are you on? Thank you.
Fantastic stuff. Next we have Kat Banyard. Kat is the inspiring director of UK Feminista and author of a great book, The Equality Illusion. Kat's building with others a new feminist movement for these times. They're not resting on what previous generations did, but making their mark in their way today. Kat, we're really pleased that you're here to speak to us.
For me, what a good society is a feminist society. A society where women and men live really equally. And women's rights must be a fundamental part of the brickwork, not just added on or slapped on the front at the end. Without it, the fundamental structure of society becomes unsound. If we look at Egypt, where women have been on the front line, a key part of the revolution, as soon as that came to its first close, they were excluded from the committee that was formulating the amendments to the Constitution, which were approved on the 19th of March. What did those proposals include? Denying women the chance to run for presidency. They also saw, days later on an International Women's Day protest when they came out, that they were strategically targeted and subjected to virginity testing. Their involvement, their place was circumscribed. Very quickly they were told that they had stayed too long at the party, and that's not good enough, and it's not good enough for any society, any new society we're trying to build. And the promise of feminism has always been that it's better for everybody, for women and men. So, in terms of building that, where are we starting from? Well, if we look back over the past 40 years, of course there's been massive progress in terms of, in this country, equality in terms of the law between women and men. We've got things like violence against women, which have gone up the agenda. But there's been stalling on the major indicator issues. So if we look at the number of women in Parliament, they're outnumbered 4-1. If we look at the pay gap, they're still paid at least 16% less than men. Now, the point about those issues is that it's what lies beneath. It's all the attitudes, the cultures, the structures which have given rise to it, not just that abstract gap, which is basically just the tip of the iceberg. We've also had huge backsliding on a very short time scale, just over the past year. Of course, we've had the coalition government has put women's economic independence into reverse. Presided over by a cabinet of 23 men and 4 women, they've launched what amounts to an attack on women's financial security, their jobs, their employment rights. And what we're seeing, of course, with this austerity agenda is that it's hitting the poorest hard, and it's particularly hitting women hardest. Now, what that does is illustrate to us very clearly that women and men still live very different and unequal lives in this country. And when you steamroll over that reality with policies, with any kind of agenda, you embed it deeper, further. But on a slightly longer time scale, over the past 2 decades or so, there's been a different kind of backsliding, which is basically amounts to a new form of sexism which has emerged, and which I think, as a society, we are in complete denial about. And that is the growth of the international sex industry. So the fundamental commercialization of sex, but I think that's a little bit misleading, that term. We're talking about the commercialization of sexism. In terms of the scale, we now have prostitution, stripping and lap dancing taking place on an unprecedented scale. This has started, basically the effect has been to pornify society. So now the cultural backdrop, our cultural landscape just bears all the hallmarks of the porn industry. Now that's started to creep into mainstream debate under the misleading term sexualization, as if it's just this broad kind of background of sex. That's not what it is. It's a background of women being treated as sex objects. It's sexist and it's targeted at women. The causes of this have been what has enabled the growth of the sex industry, of course, has been massive developments in technology, the fact that it's never been so easy to access, cheap to produce. And also economic policies, globalization, which has enabled the transit of bodies across borders. But centrally for us, I think, is how adept the sex industry has been, along with other manifestations of sexism, has been to co-opt the language of feminism, basically to hijack feminism. What the sex industry did is hold itself up as the promised land of feminism, the place that we'd all been campaigning for. So when feminists in the 1970s were calling for sexual liberation, they, and particularly Hugh Hefner himself, got up and said, brilliant, that's exactly what we can offer you. Now, it's this propaganda around, which has basically rebranded women's exploitation as their liberation, which has utterly paralysed resistance to it. And the consequences are everywhere. If we look at the women whose bodies are caught up in this trade, just in terms of prostitution, we know that 9 out of 10 of them say that they want to get the hell out, that nearly 70% have post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of this so-called work, a rate which is equivalent to victims of rape and the victims of state-sponsored torture. In terms of young girls throughout society, they're now being taught that their sexuality is a performance for others, not a genuine desire of their own. It has a massive impact on women and girls' body image and their sense of self-esteem, their sense of value and worth in this society. And for men as well, this sex industry has hijacked men's sexuality and is utterly transforming, particularly for young boys, their view of women and their view of sex. But all of this has been shrouded by a fog of rhetoric around choice. And it's because of that I think we're absolutely nowhere near to even recognising the scale of the problem that exists, let alone providing real solutions. And with regards to the sex industry, I think what this illustrates, crucially, is that building a good society is not just changing our surroundings. It's about changing ourselves and facing up to some very difficult truths. Because if we think about the reality of the pornography industry and the scale of exploitation that entails, and then we line that up against the fact that there's very few, particularly young men now, who have never used it, then we've got a real problem. We've got to start facing up to this reality. But it's perhaps this bombardment of the sex industry and of just the growing realisation, I think, amongst particularly a new generation who for too long have been sold the lie that equality exists, that they live equal lives, which just doesn't mesh with their daily reality, which has started bringing women and men onto the streets. That's why about a year ago, myself and some friends set up UK Feminista. One of the single things that we felt was holding feminism back and people from starting to tackle these issues, to start to take them on, was the complete absence of support for grassroots activism around feminism. Because over the last couple of decades, not only has new forms of sexism arisen, the activist movement, the NGO sector around feminism has essentially been obliterated, starved of funding, marginalised from any kind of public discussion. So we felt, and still feel now, that the absolute challenge is movement building, to start building up the infrastructure again. But what I think is really exciting is that, regardless of all of this, there is an incredible upsurge in activity at a grassroots level. When I first got involved in organising a few years ago, you could count the number of local activist groups probably on one hand. There are now well over 70 activist groups up and down the country, forming by the week. We get emails in from people going, you know, sounds something pretty similar to the UK Uncut experience, of people wanting there to be something in their area and then quickly learning that no one else is going to do it for them. It really is down to them. And that's exactly what they've gone and done. There's a proliferation of feminist marches, of feminist blogs and conferences. And my own little sort of indicator is kind of quite a small one, but for me it's quite significant.